One of the most misunderstood signs when dealing with an avoidant is inconsistency. The hot and cold behavior that leaves you questioning everything. Most people see it as a clear signal to walk away. And sometimes they're right, but not always. Because when you're dealing with an avoidant personality, inconsistency is not always manipulation. It's often internal conflict playing out in real time. You have to understand what's happening beneath the surface. An avoidant doesn't experience connection the way most people do. For them, intimacy triggers two opposing forces at once, desire and fear. The closer they feel to you, the more their nervous system interprets that closeness as a loss of control, a threat to their independence, even a potential source of pain. So they pull back, not necessarily because they've stopped caring, but because caring feels dangerous. Now, here's where it gets important. If someone truly doesn't care, they don't circle back. They don't check in. They don't linger in your space, even subtly. Indifference is clean. It's quiet. It's final. But avoidance is messy. It's contradictory. It leaves traces. So when you see someone who distances themselves, yet never fully disconnects, who goes silent, but then reappears, who acts detached, but still finds reasons to stay loosely connected, you're not looking at clarity. You're looking at tension. You're watching someone struggle between what they fear and what they fear. And that distinction matters because it changes how you interpret their behavior. It doesn't mean you tolerate disrespect. It doesn't mean you chase or abandon your standards. But it does mean you stop oversimplifying their actions into they care or they don't. Human psychology is rarely that binary, especially in avoidant dynamics. Think of it this way. An avoidant often tries to regulate emotional intensity by creating distance. But distance doesn't erase attachment. It just suppresses its expression. And suppression is never permanent. So what you see is this cycle. They move away to feel safe, then return because the connection still exists. Not fully processed, not fully expressed, but still there. The key is not to get lost in the inconsistency, but to observe the pattern. Is there a thread that keeps pulling them back? Is there a continuity beneath the surface level distance? Because if there is, then what you're witnessing isn't randomness. It's unresolved attachment. Now, this is where most people make a critical mistake. They react to the inconsistency emotionally. They either cling tighter, trying to secure certainty, or they shut down completely, assuming the worst. But both reactions miss the deeper truth. You're not dealing with a lack of feeling. You're dealing with a lack of capacity to handle those feelings effectively. And capacity can evolve, but only under the right conditions. Not through pressure, not through chasing, and definitely not through losing yourself in the process. It evolves through stability, through boundaries, and through a kind of grounded presence that doesn't get destabilized by every shift in their behavior. So when someone doesn't fully let you go, don't rush to label it as confusion or manipulation. Look deeper. There's often a psychological battle happening, one that has very little to do with you and everything to do with how they've learned to survive connection itself. The real question is not, why are they inconsistent? The real question is there a consistent emotional undercurrent beneath that inconsistency? Because if there is, then you're not being pulled back randomly. You're being pulled back by something they haven't yet learned how to hold. If you stay long enough in connection with an avoidant, you begin to notice something subtle, but incredibly significant. The walls don't come down all at once. There's no grand moment where they suddenly become open, expressive, and emotionally fluent. That's not how they're wired. Instead, what you get are fragments, small, almost unnoticeable moments where something real slips through. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss them. Because most people are conditioned to look for big gestures, clear declarations, obvious emotional availability. But with an avoidant, progress doesn't look like expansion. It looks like brief permission. A moment where they let you see past the defenses before quickly pulling them back up again. Maybe it's a late night conversation where they suddenly speak more honestly than usual. Maybe it's a message that carries a level of depth they typically avoid. Maybe it's a rare admission. Something about their past, their fears, or how they actually feel about you. And just as quickly as it appears, it disappears. They retreat, they deflect, they return to safety. Now, here's the mistake people make. They dismiss those moments because they're inconsistent. They say, if it was real, it would be consistent. But that assumption is based on how emotionally secure individuals operate, not how avoidants function. For an avoidant, vulnerability isn't just uncomfortable, it's disorienting. It disrupts the internal structure they've built to maintain control. So when those walls crack, even slightly, it's not casual, it's significant. It means for a brief moment, they overrode their own defense system. And that takes more effort than you realize. Think about it from a psychological standpoint. Avoidants are not devoid of emotion. They're highly regulated against it. They've trained themselves, often unconsciously, to suppress, minimize, or intellectualize feelings as a way to avoid overwhelm. So when something genuine breaks through, it's not because it's easy. It's because it's strong enough to bypass the system. That's why those small moments matter. Not because they're enough on their own, but because they reveal capacity. They show that underneath the distance, there is depth. Underneath the silence, there is something trying to be expressed. But, and this is critical, you have to interpret those moments correctly. They are not promises. They are not guarantees of immediate change. They are signals, indicators of what exists beneath the surface, not evidence of what is fully developed. And your role is not to chase those moments or try to force more of them. The moment you do that, you create pressure. And pressure for an avoidant triggers retreat. Instead, what matters is how you hold space for them, without demanding, without overreacting, without turning every moment of vulnerability into an expectation they feel they can't sustain, because what you're really doing is creating psychological safety. And safety is the only environment where those walls begin to lower more consistently over time. You're not trying to break the wall down that never works. You are allowing them to take it down themselves, piece by piece, at a pace their nervous system can tolerate. And yes, it can feel slow, it can feel uncertain, but growth in these dynamics is not measured by speed, it's measured by direction. Are those moments becoming slightly more frequent, slightly more honest, slightly less guarded? If the answer is yes, then something is shifting. So don't underestimate the quiet breakthroughs. Don't overlook the small openings just because they don't come with permanence. In the world of an avoidant, those moments are not accidents. They are effort. And effort, even when it's imperfect, tells you more than words ever could. Because when someone who is wired to hide begins, even briefly, to reveal, you're not just seeing who they are. You're seeing who they're trying to become. There's a turning point in these dynamics that most people don't recognize until they've already exhausted themselves trying to figure it out. It's the moment you stop focusing on their behavior and start refining your own. Not as a tactic, not as a way to manipulate an outcome, but as a shift in identity. You begin to move with self-respect, with clarity, with boundaries that are not negotiable. And something interesting happens when you do that with an avoidant. They notice, not always immediately and not always in obvious ways, but they feel the shift because avoidants are highly sensitive to pressure and equally sensitive to the absence of it. When you're chasing, over-explaining, or trying to secure reassurance, it activates their instinct to create distance. But when you become grounded, when your presence is no longer demanding but defined, it removes the very trigger that causes them to withdraw. And this is where many people get it wrong. They think self-respect is about detaching to provoke a reaction. It's not. That's still control, just in a different form. Real self-respect is internal. It's consistent whether they respond or not. It's the ability to say, I know what I bring, I know what I require, and I'm not going to abandon that to maintain a connection. Now, here's the paradox. That very energy, non-reactive, self-assured, emotionally stable, is what often draws an avoidant closer. Not because they suddenly become secure, but because the environment feels safer. There's no pressure to perform, no urgency they need to escape from, just space. And in that space, their defenses don't need to work as hard. So if you begin to notice that when you pull back from overextending, they lean in when you stop chasing, they initiate When you hold your boundaries, they become more present. Pay attention to that. It's not coincidence, it's feedback. It tells you that your behavior is influencing the dynamic in a meaningful way. But this is where discipline matters. Because once you see that shift, the temptation is to use it. To think if I do less, they'll do more, and suddenly your self-respect becomes conditional again. You're no longer grounded, you're strategizing, and the energy changes. Subtly, but enough for them to feel it. Avoidants may struggle with emotional expression, but they are highly attuned to shifts in pressure and expectation. The moment your actions are driven by outcome rather than authenticity, it reintroduces the very tension you were dissolving. So the goal is not to control their response. The goal is to stabilize your own state. And when that stability is real, something deeper happens. You stop reacting to every inconsistency. You stop interpreting every silence as rejection. You start seeing the dynamic with clarity instead of anxiety. And that alone changes the entire interaction. Because now you're no longer meeting avoidance with emotional volatility. You're meeting it with structure, with calm, with a sense of self that doesn't bend every time they pull away. And that's powerful, not just because it may draw them closer, but because it reveals something essential. If they respond positively to your growth, if they become more engaged, more consistent, more open, when you are at your strongest, it tells you that the connection has potential under the right conditions. It means they're not resisting you. They're responding to instability. And when that instability is removed, something in them softens. But if they don't respond, if your growth is met with continued distance or indifference, then you've gained something even more valuable. Clarity. Either way, you win because you're no longer operating from confusion. You're operating from alignment. And that's the shift that changes everything. Because the moment your self-respect becomes your foundation instead of your strategy is the moment you stop chasing connection and start attracting what can actually meet you there. Another place where people misread the situation entirely is in how they define care. Most of us are conditioned to recognize love and interest through a familiar language. Clear words, consistent reassurance, visible affection. And when those signals aren't there, the conclusion feels obvious. They must not care enough. But that assumption can be misleading when you're dealing with an avoidant, because avoidants often don't express care in ways that are emotionally obvious. They express it in ways that feel controlled, indirect, and at times almost invisible unless you know what you're looking for. Their instinct is not to amplify emotion, but to regulate it. So instead of verbalizing everything they feel, they translate it into actions that allow them to stay within their comfort zone. That might look like showing up when it actually matters. Even if they've been distant before, it might look like helping you solve a problem without making a big deal out of it. It might be consistency in small, practical ways. Checking in briefly, remembering details, maintaining a quiet presence in your life without stepping fully into emotional exposure. Now, if you're only measuring connection through emotional intensity, you'll miss this entirely. You'll dismiss it as not enough because it doesn't match your expectations. But if you step back and look at behavior over time, a different picture can emerge. You start to see patterns of care that aren't loud, but they are real. And this is where discernment becomes critical, because not all minimal effort is meaningful. You're not trying to convince yourself that scraps equal substance. What you're looking for is congruence. Do their actions, however subtle, consistently point towards some level of investment. For example, are they reliable in moments that matter, even if they struggle in everyday emotional expression? Do they follow through on things they commit to? Do they make adjustments, however small, that reflect awareness of your needs? These are not dramatic gestures, but they are indicators of intention. Avoidants often operate through what you could call functional care rather than expressive care. They may not articulate their feelings easily, but they will demonstrate them through what they do, because action feels safer than exposure. Words create vulnerability. Actions, on the other hand, can be controlled, measured, and contained. But here's the nuance. You have to be careful not to overinterpret neutral behavior as meaningful. Just because someone is polite or occasionally present doesn't mean there's depth behind it. The difference lies in consistency and context. Is their behavior stable over time? Does it show up specifically for you, or is it how they are with everyone? Because real care, even in an avoidant, has direction. It's not random. It's not generic. It's targeted, even if it's understated. And when you begin to recognize that, something shifts in how you engage. You stop demanding that they love you in your exact language. And instead, you start observing whether they are loving you in theirs. Not to lower your standards, but to understand reality more accurately. At the same time, this doesn't mean you silence your own needs. Understanding their language of care doesn't require you to abandon your own. It simply allows you to make a more informed decision. Is what they're offering in its current form something you can genuinely accept? Because there's a difference between something being real and something being sufficient. And that distinction matters. So when someone shows care in ways that are quiet, consistent, and behaviorally grounded, even if it lacks emotional intensity, you don't ignore it. You evaluate it. You place it in context. You ask whether it reflects a pattern that can grow or a limit that will remain. Because in the end, connection isn't just about how loudly someone expresses their feelings. It's about whether their actions over time prove that those feelings exist at all. There's another signal that often gets overlooked, and it requires a more nuanced kind of observation. It's not about what they say, and it's not even just about what they do. It's about what they haven't done, specifically whether they've truly replaced you on an emotional level. Now, this is where people tend to confuse movement with meaning. An avoidant might appear to move on quickly. They may distract themselves, immerse in work, engage in new connections, or create the appearance of detachment. On the surface, it can look like they've closed the chapter entirely, but external movement does not always equal internal resolution. Avoidants are highly skilled at compartmentalization. It's one of their primary coping mechanisms. Instead of processing emotional depth directly, they often redirect their focus toward productivity, independence, or new stimuli that don't demand the same level of vulnerability. It allows them to function without confronting what they feel. So yes, they may move on in behavior, but that doesn't necessarily mean they've moved on in attachment. And this is where you have to pay attention to the difference between replacement and avoidance. Replacement is when someone forms a new, genuine emotional bond that displaces the old one. Avoidance is when they simply create distance from the discomfort of what they haven't processed. For many avoidants, deep emotional connections are rare, not because they're incapable, but because they don't allow themselves to stay in that level of vulnerability long enough for it to fully develop. So when they do form a bond that reaches deeper than their usual threshold, it leaves an imprint, even if they step away from it. That imprint doesn't just disappear because they've decided to distance themselves. It lingers, and you can often see evidence of it, not in dramatic declarations, but in subtle patterns. They may reappear after periods of silence. They may maintain some form of indirect connection. They may show curiosity about your life, even when they're trying to seem unaffected. It's not always obvious. In fact, it's often quiet and inconsistent. But that's exactly the point. It reflects unresolved attachment, not indifference. Now, this doesn't mean you assume you're irreplaceable or that you hold on to false hope indefinitely. That's where people lose themselves. The goal is not to romanticize emotional unavailability. The goal is to understand what the behavior actually represents. If someone has truly replaced you emotionally, there's a clarity to it. Their energy shifts completely. There's no pull, no return, no underlying connection that keeps resurfacing. It's resolved. But if that resolution isn't there, if there's still a pattern of re-engagement, however subtle, it suggests that the bond hasn't been fully processed or released. And that matters because it tells you something out the depth of what existed. It tells you that the connection wasn't superficial. It reached a level that they don't easily replicate. However, and this is critical, depth alone is not a reason to stay indefinitely. Just because something is meaningful doesn't mean it's functional Just because it left an impact doesn't mean it can sustain a healthy dynamic in its current form. What it does give you is context. It helps you understand that what you experienced was real, even if it was incomplete. And sometimes that understanding is what allows you to move forward with clarity instead of confusion. Or if you choose to stay, it allows you to do so with awareness rather than illusion. Because you're no longer asking, did it mean anything? You already know that it did. The only question left is whether meaning on its own is enough to build something stable. Because at the end of the day, it's not the intensity of a connection that determines its future. It's whether that connection can be fully chosen, not quietly avoided. If there is one signal that outweighs all the others, one factor that should carry more weight than chemistry, history, or even emotional depth, it is this: growth. Not potential, not promises, not what you hope they could become, but actual observable movement in how they understand themselves and how they show up in the connection. Because everything we've talked about up to this point, mixed signals, small moments of vulnerability, subtle expressions of care, unresolved attachment, those are indicators of what exists beneath the surface. But growth is the only thing that tells you whether that depth has a future. An avoidant who lacks self-awareness will repeat the same patterns indefinitely. Not because they want to hurt you, but because they don't see the pattern clearly enough to change it. To them, distancing feels justified. Silence, feels necessary. Emotional withdrawal feels like stability. And without awareness, there is no interruption to that cycle. But the moment awareness begins, something shifts. It might not be dramatic. In fact, it rarely is. It often starts with small acknowledgments, subtle admissions that they struggle with closeness or that they recognize their tendency to pull away. It might show up as a willingness to have slightly more uncomfortable conversations or an effort, however imperfect, to stay present instead of disappearing. And those moments matter because awareness is the foundation of change. You cannot transform a pattern you refuse to see. Now, here's where you need to be precise in your evaluation. Words alone are not enough. Anyone can say, I know I have issues, or I'm trying, but growth is not defined by what someone says. It's defined by what they do differently over time. Are they interrupting their usual patterns, even in small ways? Are they communicating a little more instead of shutting down completely? Are they taking responsibility for their behavior rather than deflecting or minimizing it? These are the markers of real development. And development, even when it's slow, is meaningful because it tells you that they are not fixed in their current state. It tells you that the walls you've been experiencing are not permanent structures. They are defenses that can be understood, challenged, and gradually lowered. And this is critical, you cannot do that work for them. This is where many people get stuck. They see the potential for growth, and they take it upon themselves to facilitate it. They become more patient, more understanding, more accommodating, hoping that their consistency will inspire change. But growth that is dependent on your effort is not sustainable. It has to be internally driven. It has to come from their own recognition that their patterns are limiting their ability to experience connection in a meaningful way. Otherwise, what you're participating in is not growth. It's maintenance. You're stabilizing a dynamic that they have no real incentive to evolve beyond. So the question becomes very simple, even if it's not easy to answer. Are they doing the work or are you doing it for them? Because when an avoidant begins to genuinely grow, you don't have to convince yourself of it. You can see it. You can feel it. There is a shift in consistency, in effort, in willingness to meet you somewhere closer to the middle. It may not be perfect. It may not match your pace, but it is real. And that's what makes the difference. Because at the end of the day, connection is not sustained by how strongly someone feels. It's sustained by how willing they are to evolve beyond the patterns that limit those feelings. So if you see growth, even in its early stages, you're not just looking at who they are. You're looking at who they're choosing to become. And that choice, made consistently over time, is the only thing that can turn possibility into something real. So when you step back and look at the full picture, what you begin to realize is this. Connection with an avoidant is not defined by surface behavior alone. It's defined by patterns, by underlying intention, and most importantly, by direction. You've seen the signs. The inconsistency that isn't always indifference, but internal conflict. The small cracks in their emotional walls that reveal something real beneath the surface. The way they respond when you step into self-respect and stop abandoning yourself to maintain the connection. The quiet, non-traditional ways they show care, through actions rather than words. The reality that deep connections are not easily replaced for them, even if they try to move on. And above all, the one factor that outweighs everything else, whether they are actually growing, because that's what this ultimately comes down to. Not whether it's complicated, it will be. Not whether it's emotional, it is. Not even whether it's real. Sometimes it truly is. The real question is whether it's evolving, because you can have chemistry without consistency. You can have depth without stability. You can have meaning without movement. And none of those on their own are enough. So keeping trying is not about holding on blindly. It's not about proving your worth or waiting endlessly for someone to become who you need them to be. It's about awareness. It's about recognizing when something has the foundation to grow and when it's simply repeating itself in a different form. If the signs point toward effort, a war, and gradual change, then what you're investing in has direction, and direction creates possibility. But if you find yourself constantly justifying, constantly waiting, constantly hoping without evidence of movement, then you're not building something. You're preserving something that isn't evolving. And you have to be honest enough to see the difference, because your time, your energy, your emotional capacity, these are not things you give away based on potential alone. They are investments, and every investment should show some form of return, not perfection, not immediacy, but progress. So in the end, it's simple, even if it's not easy. Don't stay because it's intense. Don't stay because it's familiar. Don't stay because it once meant something. Stay only if it's growing, because the only connections worth fighting for are the ones that are also fighting to become something more.